The kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator when I heard my son's voice through the thin wall. "Mom probably has 6 months left. We should start planning the funeral arrangements." I froze with my teacup halfway to my lips. Planning my funeral, I was healthier than I'd been in years. My name is Betty, and at 74, I'd survived breast cancer, outlived my husband by 8 years, and still climbed 3 flights of stairs to my apartment every single day without losing my breath. 6 months? Where did that number come from? I set my teacup down so quietly it barely made a sound against the saucer. The delicate china had belonged to my mother, passed down through 3 generations of strong women who had faced their own battles and survived them all. My heart was pounding, but I needed to hear more. Through the paper-thin walls of my small apartment, I could make out my son David's voice clearly now, along with his wife Martha's responses. "The doctor said the treatment stopped working," David continued, his voice carrying that matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing business deals. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, my breath catching in my throat. What treatment? I hadn't been to a doctor in 3 months, and that was just for my regular checkup with Dr. Harrison. He had said I had the health of a woman 20 years younger, marveling at my blood pressure readings and the clear results of my latest mammogram. "Should we call the funeral home now?" Martha's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was asking about grocery shopping or planning a weekend trip to the beach. "I found that place downtown that offers payment plans. They have a basic package for under 5,000. Under 5,000. For my life. For 74 years of breathing, loving, struggling, celebrating. For the woman who had changed their diapers, helped with homework, babysat their children, and sent birthday cards with money tucked inside every year without fail." But here's what they didn't know about me. What I had carefully kept private for reasons that were about to become crystal clear. I hadn't told them about my recent comprehensive health examination, where Dr. Harrison had actually requested to use my test results as an example for his medical students. My cholesterol was perfect, my blood pressure was that of a 30-year-old marathon runner, and my latest scans showed no trace of the cancer that had tried to claim me 15 years ago. In fact, Dr. Harrison had jokingly said I was likely to outlive him, and he was 20 years younger. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing like it hadn't in years. They were planning my funeral based on what exactly? A lie? A misunderstanding? Or something far more sinister that I wasn't ready to contemplate yet? "We should probably start going through her things too," Martha added, and I could hear the excitement creeping into her voice now. "That jewelry collection alone could pay for the service and leave us with extra. And have you seen the silver tea service she keeps in the dining room cabinet? That's probably worth thousands." My jewelry collection. The diamond earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. The pearl necklace that had been my grandmother's worn on my wedding day and carefully preserved for my granddaughter Emma when she turned 18 next year. The silver tea service that had been a wedding gift from Robert's parents, polished lovingly every month for 47 years. They were already dividing up my possessions like vultures, circling roadkill. I had a choice to make right then and there, standing in my small kitchen with my mother's teacup trembling in my hands. I could march into that room and demand answers, my voice rising with the righteous fury of a mother betrayed. I could cry, collapsing into the kind of heartbroken sobbing that would make them feel guilty for exactly 5 minutes before they returned to their calculations. I could pretend I never heard anything, live the rest of my apparently numbered days walking on eggshells around my own son. But as I stood there looking around the kitchen where I had made thousands of meals for my family, where I had packed David's school lunches every morning for 12 years, where I had taught him to crack eggs and flip pancakes on lazy Sunday mornings, a different idea began forming in my mind. An idea that would teach them a lesson they'd never forget, and reveal the true content of their characters once and for all. What if I gave them exactly what they seemed to want? What if I let them plan my funeral, experience my death, and see exactly how they behaved when they thought no one was watching? "Did you check if she has life insurance?" Martha's voice drifted through the wall again. "2 policies," David replied without hesitation. "One for 200,000 and another for 300. Plus the house is paid off, and there are some investments I found records of when I was helping her with her taxes last year." Helping me with my taxes. I had done my own taxes for 50 years, but David had insisted on helping this year, saying it was too complicated for someone my age. Now I understood why he had been so interested in reviewing every document, every statement, every record of my financial life. The conversation continued, but I had heard enough. I needed to make some phone calls, and I needed to make them quickly. Time to find out exactly how far down this rabbit hole went, and time to start planning the most important performance of my life. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Harold Steinberg, at exactly 9 a.m. We'd known each other for 30 years, ever since Robert and I had bought our first house and needed someone to handle the paperwork. Harold had guided us through real estate purchases, business investments, and the difficult legal maze that followed Robert's death. More importantly, Harold was one of the few people who knew the real extent of my financial situation, including accounts and properties that I had never discussed with David. "Betty, you want to do what?" Harold's voice crackled through the phone, and I could picture him adjusting his thick glasses and leaning forward in that way he did when a client said something particularly unexpected. "I want to stage my own death, Harold, just temporarily, just long enough to see what my family really thinks of me, and more importantly, what they plan to do about it." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of Harold's breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside his downtown office. "Betty, that's quite unusual, and potentially illegal in some circumstances. Are you feeling all right? Is this about Robert's anniversary coming up?" "Harold, I'm feeling clearer than I have in months. And no, this isn't about grief or depression or any kind of mental breakdown." I told him about the funeral planning conversation I had overheard, about the casual way they had discussed my belongings, about David's mysterious knowledge of my insurance policies and investments. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or disapproval. When I finished, he sighed deeply, and I could hear papers rustling as he presumably reached for a legal pad to start taking notes. "You know, Betty, in 40 years of practicing law, I've seen families torn apart by less than what you're describing. I've witnessed children who couldn't wait for their parents to die, who forged documents and manipulated elderly relatives for financial gain. But I've never had a client who wanted to test their family's true intentions quite so dramatically. Harold, if you think this is too risky or too crazy, just say so. But I need to know the truth about my son. I need to know if the boy I raised, the man I sacrificed for, really sees me as nothing more than an obstacle between him and my money." There was another pause, longer this time. Then Harold's voice returned, stronger and more decisive. "If you're serious about this, Betty, and I mean absolutely certain, then we need to do it right. We need to create a situation that will reveal their true intentions without putting you in actual danger or creating legal problems that could haunt us later." Harold and I spent 3 hours that morning crafting what he called the most ethically questionable, but legally sound plan he had ever been asked to devise. We would create a fake will, one that left modest amounts to David and Martha, but donated the bulk of my estate to various charities. We would plant this document where they would find it easily, along with fake financial statements that drastically underestimated my actual wealth. Meanwhile, my real will, the one that actually mattered legally, would remain safely in Harold's vault along with accurate documentation of all my assets. But a fake will wouldn't be enough. I needed more than just disappointed heirs. I needed to see how they would behave if they thought I was actually dying, if they thought they could influence my final decisions, or, God forbid, accelerate the timeline. "You need a medical professional," Harold said, reading my thoughts. "Someone who can help you appear genuinely ill without actually compromising your health. And Betty, I have to ask, are you prepared for what you might discover? Are you ready to learn that your son might be capable of things that will change your relationship forever?" I thought about that question for a long moment, staring out my window at the street where David had learned to ride his bicycle, where he had played with neighborhood children, where he had grown from an innocent boy into the man who was now planning my funeral while I was still healthy and alive. "Harold, I think I already know what I'm going to discover. I just need proof." That afternoon, I called my friend Margaret, a retired nurse who lived 2 floors down in my building. Margaret had helped me through Robert's final illness, spending countless hours at the hospital, advocating with doctors, helping me understand medical terminology and treatment options. She understood medical procedures better than anyone I knew, and more importantly, she had maintained friendships with colleagues who still worked at the hospital where she had spent 30 years of her career. "You want me to help you fake your own death?" Margaret's eyebrows shot up to her hairline as we sat in her living room, surrounded by the photographs of grandchildren and the medical textbooks she still consulted when friends asked for advice. Betty, have you completely lost your mind? Maybe, I admitted, setting down the cup of coffee she had offered me. But Margaret, you should have heard them. They were picking out coffins like they were choosing wallpaper. They were discussing my jewelry like they were planning a shopping trip. Margaret studied my face for a long moment, her experienced nurse's eye taking in details that most people would miss. She had seen families at their worst during medical crises, had witnessed the ugly reality of what people were capable of when money and inheritance were involved. Then she smiled, that mischievous smile I remembered from our younger days when we would get into trouble at church social events. The smile that had made her favorite among the terminal patients who needed someone to make them laugh in their final days. Well, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. And Betty, if what you suspect is true, then they deserve whatever they get. Margaret had connections at the hospital where she'd worked for 3 decades. More importantly, she had access to medical knowledge and supplies that could make someone appear to be in the final stages of a terminal illness without actually causing harm. She had seen enough real deaths to know exactly how to simulate the symptoms convincingly. But before we could proceed, there was something I had to do, something that would make this entire deception worthwhile, and ensure that justice would be served regardless of what we discovered. I needed to change my real will, and I needed to start documenting everything. 3 days later, I began my performance, and let me tell you, 74 years of life had taught me a thing or two about acting. It started subtly, the way real illness often does. I called David on a Tuesday morning, letting my voice sound just a little weaker than usual, adding a slight tremor that suggested fatigue or anxiety. "I'm feeling a bit tired today, sweetheart," I said, allowing a small cough to interrupt my words. "Maybe I should see Dr. Harrison. I've been having some dizzy spells, and my chest feels tight." "Oh, you don't need to bother him, Mom." David's voice was quick, dismissive, carrying that patronizing tone that adult children sometimes use with their aging parents. "You know how these doctors are. They just want to run expensive tests that don't tell you anything useful. Besides, you've always been a bit of a hypochondriac." A hypochondriac. This from the son whose every childhood sniffle had sent me rushing to the pediatrician, whose every scraped knee had been treated like a medical emergency worthy of ice cream and extra story time. "Maybe you're right," I replied, letting disappointment color my voice. "I just thought, well, at my age it's better to be safe." "Mom, you're being dramatic. You're fine. Just rest and drink some tea." Interesting response from a son who supposedly thought I had 6 months to live and was already planning my funeral arrangements. The next day, I escalated the performance. When David visited for our weekly coffee, I stumbled slightly while walking from the kitchen to the living room. Just enough for him to notice, just enough to suggest that my balance was compromised. I held onto the wall for support, breathing a little heavier than necessary, and allowed my hand to shake slightly as I set down the coffee pot. "Mom, are you okay?" But even as he asked, I could see his eyes doing something that broke my heart. Instead of focusing on my face with concern, instead of reaching out to steady me or help me sit down, he was glancing around my apartment with an appraiser's eye. His gaze lingered on my antique furniture, the silver tea service Robert had given me for our anniversary, the original oil painting we had bought during our honeymoon in Europe. "I'm fine, dear. Just a bit dizzy. It passes." He didn't offer to help me sit. He didn't suggest calling a doctor. He didn't even ask if I needed anything. But he did pick up one of my crystal paperweights from the coffee table, turning it over in his hands as if estimating its value. That evening I heard them through the wall again, their voices carrying clearly through the thin barrier that separated my apartment from the empty unit next door where they thought they were having a private conversation. "She's getting worse," David told Martha, and there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. Not worry, not sadness, satisfaction. "Maybe we should move up our timeline," Martha replied. "Timeline? What timeline?" I pressed my ear closer to the wall, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it. "Did you call about the insurance?" Martha asked. "I called both companies. They said, as long as she's been sick for more than 2 years, there's no investigation period. The payouts are automatic once we file the death certificates." 2 years? I hadn't been sick for 2 years. I hadn't been sick at all. Unless they had been documenting a fictional illness, creating a medical history that didn't exist, laying the groundwork for something I was only beginning to understand. "What did you tell them about her condition?" "Progressive heart failure, complicated by depression and early-stage dementia." I said she'd been refusing treatment, and that the doctors didn't expect her to last much longer. I felt my knees go weak. They weren't just planning my funeral, they were creating a medical narrative that would explain my death and ensure rapid insurance payouts. They had been setting this up for months, possibly years. Margaret arrived that night with a small medical bag, her face grave with the weight of what we were attempting. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Betty? Once we start, there's no going back until it's over. And based on what you've told me about their conversation, this might be more dangerous than we originally thought." I thought about what I'd overheard, about the insurance calls, about the fictional medical history, about the way David's eyes had lingered on my possessions instead of showing concern for my well-being, about the timeline they wanted to move up. "Margaret, I think they're planning to kill me, and I need to know for certain before I decide what to do about it." Margaret opened her bag and pulled out a small vial filled with clear liquid. "This is a cardiac medication that will slow your heart rate dramatically and make your skin appear pale and clammy. The effects last about 4 hours, but during that time, to anyone without advanced medical training, you'll appear to be dying or recently deceased." She also pulled out a small device that looked like a hearing aid. "This will allow you to hear everything that's happening around you, while you appear unconscious. It's virtually invisible when properly positioned." But here's what I hadn't told Margaret or Harold or anyone else. The real reason I was willing to risk this elaborate deception. The reason that went beyond testing my family's love or loyalty. 3 days earlier, when I'd gone to update my will with Harold, I'd asked him to conduct a comprehensive review of all my financial accounts and insurance policies. What we discovered was shocking and infuriating. Someone had been making inquiries about my life insurance policies for months. Someone had been asking detailed questions about beneficiaries, payout amounts, claim procedures, and the company's policies regarding deaths from natural causes versus accidents or suicides. Someone who knew my policy numbers, my social security number, and my medical history. Someone who had access to my personal documents and private information. The only people who had that level of access were David and Martha. Harold had traced the inquiries through his contacts at the insurance companies. The person making the calls had identified himself as my son, claiming he was helping me organize my affairs due to my declining mental state. He had asked specific questions about waiting periods, medical examinations required for claims, and whether the policies would pay out if I died at home versus in a hospital. But it got worse. Harold had also discovered that someone had been accessing my medical records, using forged authorization forms to obtain information from Dr. Harrison's office. Someone had been building a case for my declining health, creating documentation that would support an insurance claim. The medical records showed visits I had never made, treatments I had never received, and a diagnosis of conditions I had never had. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that seemed perfect for what I was about to do. The weather felt like an omen, nature itself setting the stage for the most important performance of my life. Margaret arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, carrying her medical supplies in a discreet black bag and wearing the grave expression of someone about to participate in something unprecedented. She had barely slept, she told me, spending the night reviewing medical textbooks and consulting with a trusted colleague about the safest way to simulate death without actually causing harm. "Last chance to change your mind, Betty," she said, setting her bag on my kitchen table with careful precision. "Once we start this, there's no turning back until it's over. And given what you've discovered about their insurance inquiries and medical record access, we could be dealing with people who are more dangerous than we initially thought." I looked around my apartment one more time, at the photographs of David as a child, smiling and innocent, at the artwork Robert and I had collected over decades of marriage, at the comfortable furniture where I had spent countless evenings reading and knitting and living the quiet life of a woman who thought she was loved and valued. "Margaret, they've been planning to kill me for months, possibly years. They've created fake medical records, made fraudulent insurance inquiries, and last night I heard David tell Martha that they needed to move up the timeline. I'm not safe, whether we do this or not. At least this way I'll have proof of what they're capable of." Margaret nodded grimly and began preparing the medication that would slow my vital signs to nearly undetectable levels. "The injection will take effect within 5 minutes. Your heart rate will drop to around 25 beats per minute. Your breathing will become so shallow that it's barely perceptible, and your skin will take on the pale, cool appearance of someone who has passed away." She also showed me a tiny camera, no larger than a button, that we would hide in my bedroom. "Harold insisted on this. Everything that happens will be recorded." If they do anything, anything at all that confirms your suspicions, we'll have evidence that will hold up in court. The medication Margaret gave me was unlike anything I'd experienced in 74 years of life. Within minutes of the injection, I felt my heart rate slowing dramatically, each beat becoming more distinct and separated by longer intervals. My skin grew pale and cold to the touch, and my breathing became so shallow that even I couldn't detect it without concentrating completely. Margaret monitored everything with professional precision, checking my pulse every few minutes and adjusting my position to make the scene look natural. Your pulse is down to 23 beats per minute. Your skin temperature has dropped 6 degrees. To anyone without advanced medical training and proper equipment, you would appear to be deceased. We had timed everything perfectly. David was supposed to visit at 10 a.m. for our usual Saturday morning coffee, a weekly tradition that had started after Robert's death when I had needed the company and David had seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. How naive I had been to think his visits were motivated by love rather than reconnaissance. At 9:45, I positioned myself on my bedroom floor next to the bed, making it look like I had collapsed while trying to reach the telephone on my nightstand. Margaret hid in the bathroom, leaving the door slightly ajar so she could observe everything through the crack while remaining unseen. The hidden camera was positioned to capture the entire room, and the listening device in my ear would allow me to hear every word clearly. David's key turned in the lock at exactly 10 o'clock. I heard his footsteps crossing the hardwood floor of my living room, heard him calling out in that familiar voice that had once brought me such joy. "Mom? Mom, I'm here." Sorry I'm a few minutes late. Traffic was terrible. Footsteps across the living room, then the kitchen, then approaching my bedroom. A pause in the doorway. Then, "Oh my God, Martha, Martha, get over here right now." I heard Martha's heels clicking rapidly across the floor, that distinctive sound of the expensive shoes she always wore, shoes that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Through barely opened eyelids, I saw her appear in the doorway, saw her face register what appeared to be shock and concern. Here's what I expected: immediate panic, tears, frantic calls to 911, desperate attempts at CPR, the kind of response any normal person would have when discovering their mother-in-law apparently dead on the bedroom floor. Here's what happened instead. Martha checked her watch. Actually checked her watch, as if she had been expecting this and wanted to note the time for some kind of record. "Is she?" Martha's voice was barely a whisper, but it wasn't the whisper of someone overwhelmed by grief. It was the whisper of someone trying not to be overheard. David knelt beside me, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe I had been wrong about everything. Maybe my son did love me, and the conversations I had overheard were just practical discussions about inevitable future events. Maybe I was about to feel his hands checking for signs of life, hear his voice calling my name, see him reaching for his phone to call for emergency help. He pressed 2 fingers to my neck, checking for a pulse with the clinical efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret's medication was working perfectly. My pulse was so faint and slow that it would be nearly impossible to detect without proper medical equipment and training. "I can barely feel anything," David said, his voice steady and controlled. But his tone wasn't panicked or heartbroken. It was calculating, professional, like a businessman checking off items on a to-do list. "Should we call 911? Martha asked. There was a pause. A long, terrible pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Let's wait a few minutes. Make sure." "Wait, make sure of what? Make sure I was actually dead? Make sure there was no chance I might recover? Or make sure that enough time passed to ensure I wouldn't recover? David, shouldn't we at least try CPR or something?" Martha's voice carried an edge of nervousness, but not the kind of nervousness you'd expect from someone who had just discovered a family member's body. "She's been sick for months, Martha. The doctor said this could happen any time. Dr. Harrison told me last week that her heart was barely functioning and that we should prepare ourselves for the inevitable." But Dr. Harrison had never said any such thing. Dr. Harrison had declared me healthier than most people half my age. Dr. Harrison didn't even know I had been having any health problems, because I hadn't been having any health problems. Unless David had been feeding Dr. Harrison false information, creating a fictional medical narrative that would explain my death and minimize questions. Margaret had positioned herself perfectly to observe through the bathroom door crack, and I knew she was recording everything on her phone as backup to the hidden camera. What she was witnessing would haunt both of us forever, because what I heard next changed everything I thought I knew about my son, and revealed the true depth of the conspiracy that had been building around me for months. "Where do you think she keeps the insurance papers?" Martha's voice was hushed, but it wasn't hushed from grief or respect for the dead. It was hushed the way people whisper when they're doing something they know is wrong. "Probably in the desk." Mom was always obsessively organized about that stuff. David's voice came from somewhere near my dresser, and I could hear drawers opening and closing. I listened in growing horror as my son and daughter-in-law began systematically searching through my belongings, while they thought I was lying dead on the bedroom floor. Not 5 minutes had passed since they had found me, not 5 minutes since they had supposedly discovered that the woman who had raised David, loved him, sacrificed for him, and devoted her life to his well-being, had apparently died alone and afraid. And they were looting my possessions like professional thieves. "Here's the life insurance policy," Martha said, and I could hear papers rustling. 500,000 from Metropolitan and another 300,000 from Prudential. "What about the house insurance? And did you find the investment statements?" David's voice came from the living room now. "House insurance? What did property insurance have to do with my death? Unless they were planning something that would require both life insurance and property insurance claims. I still can't believe she never told us about the rental properties in Florida," Martha continued. 4 units generating over $6,000 a month in income. She was sitting on a gold mine and living like she was poor. Rental properties? What rental properties in Florida? I had never owned property in Florida. I had visited Florida exactly twice in my life, both times for brief vacations with Robert. That's when I realized something that made my blood freeze in my veins. They knew things about my finances that weren't true. They had information about assets that didn't exist. Someone had been creating a fictional financial portfolio for me, inflating my worth beyond anything approaching reality. But why would someone exaggerate my wealth unless they needed to justify something? Unless they needed to create a motive for murder that would satisfy insurance investigators or police detectives. "Did you find the safe deposit box key yet?" David asked, his voice carrying a note of urgency now. Safe deposit box. I did have a safe deposit box, and I kept the key hidden in a hollowed-out book on my shelf. Pride and Prejudice, a book I had read so many times that no one would think to examine it closely. It was a place I had never shared with anyone, except Robert during his final illness, when I had needed him to know where our important documents were stored. But Robert had died 8 years ago. The only way David could know about the safe deposit box was if he had been systematically searching through my possessions for months, looking for assets and valuables, cataloging my worth like an estate appraiser. "I found it." Martha's voice carried a note of triumph. "It was in this old book." God, she was paranoid about hiding things. Paranoid. As if protecting my valuables from theft was a character flaw rather than basic common sense. "Martha, what if someone questions the timing?" David's voice carried a note of worry now. "What if the neighbors heard something? What if someone wants to know why we didn't call for help immediately?" "Questions what timing? Your mother's been sick for months. Everyone in the building knows that. Mrs. Peterson from downstairs has been asking me about her health every time she sees me. I've been telling people she was getting confused, forgetting things, having chest pains." Mrs. Peterson, my friend and neighbor for 15 years. Martha had been spreading lies about my health throughout the building, creating witnesses who would testify that I had been declining, that my death was expected and natural. "What did you tell Dr. Harrison's office about her symptoms?" Martha asked. "I called last week and told them she was having severe chest pains and confusion, but that she was refusing to come in for treatment. I said she was becoming paranoid and combative about medical care." Paranoid and combative. 2 terms that would appear in my medical records, creating a picture of an elderly woman whose death could be attributed to her own refusal to seek proper treatment. "David, check her pulse again," Martha said. Martha's cold fingers pressed against my neck, searching for the slow, faint heartbeat that Margaret's medication had created. Thanks to the drug, my pulse was so weak and irregular that it would be nearly impossible to detect without proper equipment. I think she's gone, David." The silence that followed was the longest 30 seconds of my life. I waited for tears, for expressions of grief, for some indication that my death meant something to the son I had raised and the daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my family. Instead, I heard the sound of a cork popping. They were opening champagne. "Is this really appropriate?" Martha whispered. "Mom would have wanted us to celebrate her life," David replied. but his tone suggested he was celebrating something else entirely. Besides, she's not in pain anymore. She's finally at peace. At peace. As if I had been suffering, as if death had been a mercy rather than a tragedy. That's when Martha said the words that shattered any remaining hope I had for my son's redemption. So the medication definitely worked faster than we expected. Medication? What medication? I wasn't sure the dosage was right, David responded. But Dr. Chen said it would be untraceable after a few hours, especially in someone with her supposed heart condition. Dr. Chen? I had never heard of any Dr. Chen, but apparently David had. And apparently Dr. Chen had provided medication that was designed to kill me in a way that would appear natural and leave no evidence. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was hearing. They hadn't just been planning my death. They had been actively working to cause it. The timeline Martha had mentioned wasn't about when to expect my natural death. It was about when to administer whatever poison they had been giving me. How long do we have before the effects wear off? Martha asked. Effects wear off? What was going to wear off? Dr. Chen said 6 to 8 hours, long enough for the body to be removed and the preliminary death certificate to be filed. By the time anyone could run detailed tests, if they even thought to run them, any traces would be gone. Body removal. Death certificate. They had planned every detail, coordinated with medical professionals, arranged for my death to be processed quickly and efficiently with minimal investigation. But then David said something that made me realize their plan was even more elaborate and horrifying than I had imagined. Did you give her the morning tea like we discussed? Tea. The special herbal tea that David had been bringing me every morning for the past month. For your health, Mom, he had said each time. It has herbs that will help with your energy and circulation. I had been drinking poison for a month, administered by my own son, designed to gradually weaken me and create symptoms that would support their fictional narrative of my declining health. I gave her a double dose this morning, Martha replied. I figured since we were moving up the timeline, we needed to make sure it would work. A double dose of poison in my morning tea. Except I hadn't drunk my morning tea today. I had been too nervous about the plan with Margaret, too focused on preparing for the fake death scene. The tea David had brought was still sitting on my kitchen counter, untouched, which meant that whatever they thought they had given me hadn't actually been administered, which meant that my apparent death was entirely due to Margaret's medication, and I was going to recover completely in a few hours, which meant I was about to come back from the dead and confront two people who had just confessed to murdering me. But first, I needed to hear the rest of their plan. I needed to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy went and who else might be involved. They thought I was dead, but I was very much alive, getting stronger as Margaret's medication began to wear off, and getting angrier with every word they spoke. Through the tiny listening device Margaret had given me, I heard David on the phone with someone, his voice carrying the practiced grief of a professional mourner. Yes, this is David Chen. My mother, Betty Chen, has passed away at her residence. Yes, we'd like to arrange for the body to be picked up as soon as possible. She had been ill for several months, and this was expected. No, we don't think an autopsy will be necessary. Her doctor has been treating her for heart failure and can provide the death certificate.
Body pickup. Immediate removal. No autopsy. They were moving fast to ensure that my body would be processed and prepared for burial,
before anyone could run the kind of detailed medical tests that might reveal the truth about what had happened to me. But there was something else in David's tone, something that suggested this wasn't his first conversation with this particular funeral home. He knew exactly who to call, exactly what to say, exactly how to expedite the process. How soon can you be here? David asked. We'd prefer to have her removed before the neighbors start asking questions. Yes, I understand about the paperwork. Dr. Chen will fax the death certificate directly to your office within the hour. Dr. Chen again. The mysterious doctor who had provided untraceable poison and was apparently prepared to file fraudulent death certificates. This conspiracy involved medical professionals who were willing to participate in murder for the right price. The sound of papers rustling filled the room as David and Martha continued their systematic looting of my possessions. Where's the real will? Martha asked. We found that fake one in the desk that leaves everything to charity, but there has to be a real one somewhere. She wouldn't have cut us out completely. She probably hid it somewhere. But it doesn't matter, we have the safe deposit box key now. Whatever's in there is ours by right of inheritance, and even if there's a will that cuts us out, we can contest it, especially with her documented mental decline and paranoia. documented mental decline, paranoia. They had been building a case against my mental competency for months, creating a paper trail that would allow them to contest any will that didn't favor them while simultaneously establishing grounds for my expected death. Safe deposit box. They had no idea what was actually in my safe deposit box, or who else had access to it. Harold had insisted on being added as a co-signer years ago, precisely to prevent the kind of situation that was unfolding now. It was time to start phase 2 of our plan. I began to move my fingers slightly, just enough to suggest that rigor mortis hadn't set in, that perhaps I wasn't as dead as they thought. Margaret had timed the medication perfectly. I was regaining strength and mobility just as they were settling into their victory celebration. "David, did you see her hand move?" Martha's voice carried a note of panic. "Dead bodies can have muscle spasms for hours after death. It's completely normal." David's response was so matter-of-fact, so knowledgeable about post-mortem body behavior, that I wondered how much research he had done into the process of death and dying. But I wasn't done with my performance yet. I needed them to reveal more, to confess to crimes that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives in prison for what they had planned to do to me. I let out a small sigh, barely audible, just enough to suggest that perhaps there was still life in my supposedly dead body. "David, she's breathing." Martha's voice rose to a near shriek. "She's not breathing. You're imagining things because you're nervous." But I could hear uncertainty creeping into David's voice now. I opened my eyes slowly, just a crack, just enough to see their faces through my eyelashes. Martha screamed so loudly, I thought she might bring the neighbors running. David dropped the champagne bottle he had been holding, and it shattered across my hardwood floor in a shower of glass and foam. "Hello, children," I said, sitting up slowly as feeling and strength returned to my limbs. Margaret's medication was wearing off perfectly, and color was returning to my face as my heart rate normalized. "Having a nice little celebration?" "Mom? But you were dead." David's face had gone completely white, and he was backing toward the door as if he had seen an actual ghost. "Funny thing about being dead," I replied, standing up with more strength than I'd shown in weeks. "It gives you a wonderful opportunity to hear what people really think of you, and what they plan to do about it." Martha was hyperventilating now, her hands shaking as she tried to process the impossibility of what she was seeing. "This isn't possible. You weren't breathing. You didn't have a pulse." "Oh, but I was breathing, Martha. Very quietly, very slowly, but breathing nonetheless, and listening to everything." I walked to my dresser, where they had scattered my personal papers, including the fake will Harold and I had prepared specifically for this moment. Among the scattered documents were insurance policies they had no right to access, financial statements they had obtained through fraud, and medical records that had been falsified to support their murder plot. "Looking for something specific?" I asked, holding up the fake will that left most of my estate to charity. David's eyes fixed on the document, with the desperate intensity of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. "Mom, we can explain everything." "Explain what, David?" "How you've been poisoning my tea for a month. How you told Dr. Harrison I was mentally incompetent and refusing treatment. How you created fake medical records to support an insurance fraud scheme. How you've been planning to have my body removed without proper medical examination." The color drained from David's face completely as he realized exactly how much I had heard and understood. "Or maybe you'd like to explain how you accessed my private medical records illegally. How you made fraudulent inquiries to my insurance companies. How you've been spreading lies about my health throughout the building to create witnesses who would support your story." Margaret emerged from the bathroom, no longer hiding, carrying her medical bag and wearing the stern expression of someone who had witnessed something unforgivable. "I think you should both sit down," she said calmly, pulling out her phone. "Betty has some things to show you, and the police are going to want to see them too." I walked to my bookshelf and pulled out a thick folder that Harold had prepared for this moment. Inside were photocopies of every document they had accessed illegally, recordings of every fraudulent phone call they had made to insurance companies, documentation of every lie they had told to medical professionals, and detailed evidence of the financial fraud they had been committing for months. "You see, children, when you start planning someone's murder, you should probably make sure they're actually going to cooperate with dying." David collapsed into my armchair, his face buried in his hands. "Murder? Mom, we were just trying to what? Help me transition peacefully? Make me comfortable in my final days? Speed up a natural process?" Each word was delivered with the cold precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Martha finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. You don't understand, Betty. We have debts. David lost his job 8 months ago, not 6 months like we told you. You needed to ask for help instead of trying to kill me for insurance money. The room fell silent, except for the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Oh, did I mention? I said with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Harold called the police 30 minutes ago. They should be here any moment to discuss attempted murder charges, insurance fraud, medical records tampering, and conspiracy to commit murder. That's when David completely broke down. Mom, please, you have to understand, we never meant for it to go this far. The tea was just supposed to make you weak, make you seem sicker so the insurance companies wouldn't question the claims when you eventually died naturally. But then the debts kept getting worse, and Martha said maybe we could help things along just a little. Help things along. Such a gentle euphemism for murder. The medication Dr. Chen gave us was supposed to mimic a heart attack. It would have looked completely natural, especially with your supposed history of heart problems. No one would have questioned it. No one would have run tests. There it was. The full confession that Margaret's hidden camera had captured in perfect detail. And if I had actually drunk the poisoned tea this morning instead of leaving it on the counter untouched, your plan would have worked perfectly. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with realization. You didn't drink the tea? I was too nervous about other things to drink tea this morning. Which means that everything you thought you had accomplished was actually the result of a very different kind of medication, administered by someone who was helping me discover the truth about my loving family. The police arrived exactly when Harold said they would, their presence filling my small apartment with the authority of law and order. As David and Martha were read their rights and led away in handcuffs, my son turned back to me one final time. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I looked at him, this man I had raised from infancy, who had taken his first steps holding on to my fingers, who I had taught to read and ride a bicycle and throw a baseball. This man who had sat beside my hospital bed during my cancer treatment, holding my hand and promising that everything would be okay. This man who had delivered a beautiful eulogy at his father's funeral, speaking about love and family and the bonds that can never be broken. The saddest part, David, is that if you had just told me about your debts, if you had just asked me for help like the son I thought you were, I would have given you whatever you needed. I would have paid off every bill, solved every financial problem, and never asked for anything in return except your honesty and love. The door closed behind them, with a finality that seemed to echo through every room of my apartment. I was alone with Margaret and Harold, who had arrived just as the police were finishing their arrest procedures. So what now? Margaret asked, settling into the chair where David had collapsed just minutes before. I walked to my desk and pulled out my real will. The document that had originally left everything to David and Martha, the will that had been written with love and hope and the assumption that my family cared more about me than my money. Now I rewrite this properly. I think Emma deserves everything when she turns 18. She's the only one who visits me because she loves me, not because she's calculating the value of my possessions or planning my funeral while I'm still breathing. Harold nodded approvingly, pulling out his legal pad to start drafting changes. And the fake will we planted? I smiled. The first genuine smile I'd felt in months, maybe years. Let them think that's real while they're in prison. When they get out, they can spend their time trying to contest a will that leaves everything to charity. It'll give them something to focus on besides planning anyone else's murder. But the best part, the part that made everything we had risked worthwhile, came 3 days later when Emma called me. Grandma Betty, I heard what happened with Dad and Martha. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Should I come stay with you? Emma. My granddaughter, who was still 6 months away from her 18th birthday, who worked part-time at a bookstore to save money for college, who had never asked me for anything except the occasional advice about boys and homework and whether she should dye her hair purple. I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. I'm stronger than I've been in years. Good, because I was thinking, maybe when I turn 18 and graduate, I could move in with you? Help take care of you properly? We could be roommates, and I could cook dinner sometimes, and we could watch old movies and talk about books. I looked around my apartment, at the fresh flowers Margaret had brought to replace the ones that had been trampled during the police investigation. I looked at the champagne stain on the floor that I had decided to leave as a reminder of what greed and betrayal looked like when they thought no one was watching. I looked at the insurance papers scattered on my desk, papers that would never be claimed by the people who had tried to murder me for the money they represented. Emma, darling, I would love that more than anything in the world. But only if you promise me one thing. Anything, Grandma. What? Promise me you'll never plan my funeral while I'm still alive. Emma's laughter filled my apartment, with a sound I hadn't heard in far too long, the sound of genuine love, uncomplicated by greed or calculation or hidden agendas. I promise, Grandma Betty. But I also promise something else. I'll never let anyone else plan it either. And for the first time in months, I felt truly alive, truly valued, truly loved by someone who saw me as more than a collection of assets waiting to be divided. The moral of this story? Be very careful whose funeral you plan while they're still breathing. You never know who might be listening from beyond the grave, and you definitely never know who might show up at their own wake with handcuffs and arrest warrants. That's how a son's greed became the catalyst for my greatest victory. Life has a way of revealing people's true character when they think no one is watching. Sometimes the revelation comes as a whisper, sometimes as a thunderclap, but it always comes when the stakes are highest. If my story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that wisdom, patience, and careful planning can triumph over betrayal and evil intentions, then you understand the most important truth of all. The best revenge is not just survival, but justice served with precision and dignity. I have more stories to share, some heartbreaking, some triumphant, all of them true. Stories about families who forgot that love should never have a price tag, about children who lost sight of what really matters, and about grandmothers who refused to go quietly into anyone's good night. So pull up a chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, but maybe check who made it first, and hit that subscribe button because we're only just getting started, and you won't want to miss what comes next.